Part 1: The Trembling Earth. The morning of May 21, 1960, dawned over Valdivia with deceptive serenity. The southern Chilean city, cradled between rivers and forests, woke to the usual rhythm of a Saturday in late autumn. Market vendors in the Plaza de la República arranged their produce under canvas awnings, while housewives planned their weekend shopping. The Calle River flowed placidly past wooden houses built on stilts, their weathered planks testimony to generations of Valdivians who had learned to live with water as both neighbor and occasional adversary. Church bells rang out from the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Rosary, calling the faithful to morning mass. No one suspected that within hours, the earth itself would betray them. But the warning signs had been there, written in a language few could read. On May 20th, the day before, a tremor had rippled through the region, magnitude 7.0, centered near Concepción, some 300 kilometers to the north. In Concepción's narrow colonial streets, buildings had swayed and cracked. Chunks of masonry tumbled from the facade of the Universidad de Concepción's central tower. People ran into the streets, hearts pounding, waiting for the shaking to stop. When it finally did, they surveyed the damage with the weary familiarity of those who lived along the Pacific Ring of Fire. Chile had always trembled. This was merely the latest reminder. In Valdivia, that Friday tremor had been felt as a gentle, almost negligent shudder. Glasses clinked on shelves. A few people paused in their conversations, looked at each other with raised eyebrows, then continued about their business. The city had weathered earthquakes before: the devastating 1575 quake, the 1737 tremor, the 1837 earthquake that had reshaped the coastline. Each generation inherited stories of the Earth's violence, but also its mercy. Life always continued. Buildings were rebuilt. Children were born. The rivers kept flowing. What no one understood, what no one could understand with the seismological knowledge of 1960, was that the Friday earthquake was not an event unto itself. It was a prelude. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, where the Nazca tectonic plate had been grinding beneath the South American plate for millions of years, an enormous section of the Earth's crust had begun to fail. The stress that had accumulated over centuries was reaching its breaking point. The rocks were screaming silently in the dark, miles below the surface, preparing to rupture along a fault line that stretched for over 1,000 kilometers. Saturday morning proceeded with normalcy. In the working-class neighborhood of Isla Teja, Hildegard Vivar prepared breakfast for her 3 children while her husband, Roberto, a sawmill worker, planned to spend his day off repairing their roof. The smell of bread baking in outdoor ovens mixed with the scent of wet earth and eucalyptus. In the elegant homes along Avenida Prat, wealthy families discussed their plans for the afternoon, perhaps a drive to the countryside, a visit to friends in the nearby town of Corral, or simply a leisurely lunch. At the Valdivia hospital, Dr. Renato Acuña arrived for his shift, reviewing cases from the night before. The hospital, a sturdy 2-story structure built in the 1920s, was considered modern by provincial standards. Its thick walls and high ceilings had survived previous earthquakes with minimal damage. Dr. Acuña had no particular reason to worry as he walked through the corridors, greeting nurses and checking on patients. If he thought about yesterday's tremor at all, it was only in passing. The morning stretched into early afternoon. At 3:11 p.m. Valdivia time, the first shock hit. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the Andes. Those who heard it looked up, confused. The sky was overcast but showed no signs of a storm. Then the ground began to move. Not the gentle swaying of Friday's tremor, but a violent, aggressive shaking that seemed to come from every direction at once. The magnitude would later be calculated at 7.7, a major earthquake by any standard, powerful enough to level poorly constructed buildings and crack foundations throughout the region. In the Plaza de la República, market stalls collapsed as vendors and shoppers alike stumbled and fell, unable to keep their feet. The canvas awnings whipped like sails in a gale. Pyramids of oranges and apples tumbled across the cobblestones, rolling between the legs of terrified people crawling on hands and knees, seeking stability where none existed. A woman clutched her infant to her chest, her mouth open in a scream that was lost in the thunderous roar of shaking earth and crumbling masonry. The cathedral's bell tower swayed dramatically. Inside, Father Bernardo Gajardo watched in horror as the altar cross swung on its chain like a pendulum. Plaster rained from the ceiling, coating the wooden pews in white dust. Stained glass windows, some dating back to the 19th century, shattered in cascades of colored light, their fragments catching the afternoon sun as they fell. The dozen worshippers who had been attending afternoon devotions stumbled toward the exits, some praying aloud, others simply whimpering in fear. At the sawmill where Roberto Vivar worked, the violence was magnified by the nature of the enterprise. Stacks of lumber, carefully organized into towering piles, began to topple. The crash of falling wood mixed with the screams of workers diving for cover. The saw blade, still spinning from the last cut before the earthquake, shrieked against its guides as the entire building twisted on its foundations. Roberto found himself on the ground, his hands over his head, as boards rained down around him. He thought of Hildegard and the children at home, and prayed their wooden house was flexible enough to ride out the shaking. It lasted approximately 35 seconds, an eternity for those experiencing it, yet short enough that when it ended, there was a moment of collective disbelief. Had it really stopped? In the sudden, eerie silence that followed, broken only by the sound of settling debris and distant cries, people began to emerge from doorways and from beneath tables and desks. They looked at each other with wild eyes, breathing hard, taking inventory of their bodies. Broken bones? Blood? Most found themselves miraculously intact. Throughout Valdivia, the damage assessment began immediately. Windows had shattered across the city. Several older adobe buildings had partially collapsed, their mud brick walls unable to withstand the lateral forces. The power lines were down in several neighborhoods, leaving parts of the city without electricity. Water mains had ruptured in places, sending geysers into the air. But overall, the city had survived. The modern buildings stood. The bridges held. The rivers continued their ancient paths. Dr. Acuña and his staff at the hospital moved quickly to establish order. The emergency room began filling with casualties. Cuts from flying glass, broken bones from falls, a few serious crush injuries from collapsed walls. But nothing overwhelming. Nothing they couldn't handle. The doctor allowed himself a moment of relief. They had been lucky. The earthquake had been powerful, but Valdivia had withstood it. In living rooms and kitchens across the city, families gathered, comforting each other, discussing what to do next. Should they leave their homes? Sleep outside tonight in case of aftershocks? The consensus in most households was to stay alert but remain inside. After all, the worst seemed to be over. It was 3:11 p.m. Approximately 4 hours of normalcy remained. No one in Valdivia knew, no one could know, that what they had just experienced was not the main earthquake. The magnitude 7.7 shock had been merely a foreshock, a minor fracture in the crust compared to what was building beneath the ocean floor. As families swept up broken glass and shop owners surveyed their damaged inventory, as Dr. Acuña set broken bones and Father Gajardo assessed the damage to his beloved cathedral, the real catastrophe was gathering its strength. Deep in the subduction zone, where one tectonic plate dove beneath another at an angle that had remained locked for over a century, the final restraints were about to fail. When they did, they would release an amount of energy equivalent to 178 billion tons of TNT, the most powerful earthquake ever measured by instruments, a magnitude 9.5 monster that would rewrite the textbooks on seismology and remain, more than 6 decades later, the largest earthquake in recorded human history. The people of Valdivia had 4 hours. They did not know to run. Part 2. The Great Rupture. The hours between 3:11 p.m. and 7:11 p.m. passed in a state of anxious normalcy. Throughout Valdivia and the surrounding region, people moved through the rituals of post-earthquake routine with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this before. They swept broken glass into piles, nailed boards over shattered windows, checked on elderly neighbors, and reassured frightened children that the shaking was over. The earth, they told themselves and each other, had released its tension. The worst had passed. In the Vivar household on Isla Teja, Roberto had returned home to find his family shaken but unharmed. Their wooden house, built with the flexibility that generations of Chilean builders had learned to incorporate into their designs, had swayed violently but held together. A few dishes had fallen from shelves. A crack ran down one wall. But the roof remained intact, and the foundation showed no signs of serious damage. Hildegard prepared an early dinner, bread, cheese, and tea, while Roberto moved their most precious belongings to the center of the main room, away from windows and exterior walls. Their eldest daughter, Carmen, aged 12, helped her younger siblings build a fort from blankets and pillows in the safest corner of the house. If aftershocks came in the night, they would be ready. The aftershocks did come. Small ones at first, magnitude 4, magnitude 5, enough to make people pause in their activities, to grip door frames and table edges, to exchange knowing glances. This too was normal. Every major earthquake brought aftershocks. They would continue for days, perhaps weeks, gradually diminishing in frequency and intensity. An annoyance, certainly. A source of jangled nerves and interrupted sleep. But manageable. At the harbor in Corral, 15 kilometers from Valdivia as the crow flies, fisherman Luis Enriquez watched the sun begin its descent toward the Pacific horizon. The afternoon quake had caught him on land, fortunately. He had been mending nets near his boat when the shaking began. Now, as the day cooled toward evening, he debated whether to take his vessel out to deeper water. The old-timers told stories about strange behavior in the sea after earthquakes. Some said the water level dropped before rising in great waves. Others claimed fish became agitated, jumping and thrashing near the surface. Luis studied the harbor waters, looking for signs, but saw nothing unusual. The sea appeared calm, almost unnaturally so, its surface barely rippled by the evening breeze. He decided to stay in port. His wife would worry if he went out so close to nightfall, especially after the afternoon scare. He secured his boat with extra lines, double-checking each knot with the automatic precision of 4 decades at sea, then walked home through Corral's narrow streets. The town, even older than Valdivia, showed more damage from the 3/11 earthquake. Several colonial-era buildings had lost their facades, exposing interior rooms like open dollhouses. The Spanish fort that overlooked the harbor, built in 1645, had shed stones from its walls, which now lay scattered on the slope below like broken teeth. In Valdivia proper, the evening routine continued. Families gathered for dinner, though many chose to eat quickly, unwilling to linger long at the table in case more shaking began. Candles and oil lamps were lit in neighborhoods where power remained out. Battery-powered radios crackled with reports from Santiago, the distant capital, where the afternoon earthquake had been felt as a gentle, prolonged swaying. The announcer's voice carried the reassuring authority of distance. The earthquake had been centered in the south. Damage appeared moderate. Casualties were being assessed but were not expected to be severe. No mention of tsunami warnings. No particular alarm in the broadcaster's measured tones. At 6:02 p.m., a stronger aftershock hit, magnitude 6.8, powerful enough to send people running back into the streets, to topple already weakened structures, to crack walls that had survived the afternoon intact. In the hospital, Dr. Acuña braced himself against a doorframe as medical equipment rattled and crashed around him. A newly set plaster cast cracked on a patient's arm, requiring the work to be done again. But again, when the shaking stopped after 20 seconds, the assessment was the same. Damage, yes, but survivable. The hospital stood. The staff remained functional. They could handle this. No one was watching the seismographs. Valdivia had no seismological station of its own. The nearest instruments were hundreds of kilometers away in Santiago and Concepción. If they had been watching, if they had been able to interpret what those instruments were recording, they would have seen something terrifying. The foreshocks were not decreasing in intensity. They were building. The pattern of seismic waves showed not a fault settling down, but a fault approaching catastrophic failure. At 7:11 p.m., as twilight deepened over southern Chile, the earth broke. The rupture began approximately 150 kilometers offshore, at a depth of 33 kilometers below the Pacific seabed. At that point, where the Nazca plate had been diving beneath the South American plate at a rate of roughly 8 centimeters per year for millions of years, the rock finally exceeded its tensile strength. The rupture propagated both north and south along the fault line at a speed of roughly 3.5 kilometers per second, faster than a bullet, slower than sound. As it spread, it unlocked a fault segment over 1,000 kilometers long and 200 kilometers wide. The South American continent lurched westward by up to 30 meters in some locations. Simultaneously, the ocean floor shot upward by as much as 6 meters along the length of the rupture zone. Billions of tons of rock moved in an instant. The energy released was approximately 20,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It would later be calculated as magnitude 9.5, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded by seismometers, a designation it would still hold more than 60 years later. The seismic waves radiated outward at a speed of approximately 6 kilometers per second through the Earth's crust. They reached Valdivia in less than 30 seconds. Hildegard Vivar was clearing the dinner dishes when it hit. The sound came first, a roar like a freight train passing directly beneath the house, so loud it obliterated thought. Then the motion began. And it was unlike anything in her experience or imagination. The house didn't sway. It leaped. It twisted. It bucked like a living thing trying to shake off a rider. The floor became a tilting, heaving surface where standing was impossible. She fell hard, her hips striking the floorboards, dishes crashing around her in an explosion of ceramic shards. Roberto tried to reach his children but couldn't navigate the 3 meters between himself and their blanket fort. The distance might as well have been a kilometer. He crawled on his hands and knees, thrown repeatedly to his side as the house contorted around him. Walls separated from the floor. Roof beams groaned and cracked. Through the windows, those that hadn't already shattered, he could see the world outside performing an insane dance. Trees whipped back and forth so violently their trunks seemed to bend almost parallel to the ground. The earth itself rippled in visible waves like water disturbed by a stone. The sound was indescribable. The roar of the earth mixed with the screams of wood tearing, of metal twisting, of thousands of buildings across the city disintegrating simultaneously. Church bells rang wildly, triggered not by human hands but by the violent motion. Dogs howled. Car alarms, those few cars wealthy enough to have them, blared uselessly into the chaos. And beneath it all, that freight train rumble continued, the voice of the planet itself in agony. In the city center, the damage escalated from moderate to catastrophic in seconds. The Cathedral of Our Lady of the Rosary, which had survived the afternoon quake with cracked walls and broken windows, now faced forces it could not withstand. The bell tower, already weakened, swayed past its structural limits. Father Gajardo, who had returned to assess the damage, watched from the street as the tower separated from the main building in a slow, almost graceful collapse. It fell through the roof of the nave, crushing the altar, the pews, the confessionals, everything he had tended for 20 years of ministry. The crash sent a cloud of dust and pulverized stone billowing into the darkening sky. The business district along Avenida Pérez Rosales suffered even worse. Multi-story buildings, constructed in the 1920s and 1930s with unreinforced masonry, pancaked floor by floor. The Hotel Central, a landmark in the city's social life, folded in on itself like a closing accordion. Guests and staff who had survived the afternoon quake by sheltering in doorways now found themselves trapped in a collapsing structure. Some were crushed instantly. Others found themselves pinned beneath beams and rubble, conscious and screaming for help that could not possibly reach them while the ground continued its violent convulsions. At the hospital, Dr. Acuña experienced a nightmare scenario. The building, which had seemed so solid through the earlier shocks, began to fail structurally. The second floor sagged ominously. Weight-bearing walls developed cracks that widened with each pulse of seismic energy. The doctor made an instant decision: evacuate. He and his staff began the desperate work of moving patients, some in beds, some on stretchers, some carried in the arms of nurses, out of the building and onto the hospital grounds. They worked in near darkness, the power having failed completely, guided only by emergency lanterns and the occasional flash of sparks from severed electrical lines. One nurse, Maria Contreras, later recalled the surreal horror of trying to move an elderly patient down a staircase that was itself moving. The steps weren't level, she would tell investigators. They were tilting, rising and falling like piano keys being played. I held the stretcher handles and just tried not to fall. The patient was praying aloud, the Hail Mary, over and over. I found myself praying with her. The earthquake continued, and continued, and continued. Unlike the afternoon's 35 seconds or the evening's 20-second aftershock, this shaking did not stop. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Still the earth heaved and twisted. People lost all sense of time. Some would later swear the shaking lasted 10 minutes, others 15. Seismological records would show the strongest shaking persisted for approximately 3 minutes, with detectable motion continuing for more than 10 minutes. 3 minutes doesn't sound long. In conversation, 3 minutes passes unnoticed. But 3 minutes of violent earthquake is an eternity. It is long enough for terror to evolve into resignation, for panic to give way to a strange, numb acceptance. People stopped trying to escape or take shelter. They simply held on to whatever they could and waited for it to end or for death to come. Many prayed. Some wept. Others went silent, their minds retreating to some interior space where the chaos could not reach. In Corral, Luis Enriquez had made it home to his small house overlooking the harbor when the great quake struck. He and his wife, Elena, huddled in a doorframe as their possessions crashed around them. Through the window, Luis could see something that filled him with a dread deeper than the earthquake itself. The harbor was emptying. The water was receding rapidly, flowing out toward the ocean as if some enormous drain had been opened. Boats that had been floating peacefully now tilted and settled onto the harbor floor. Fish flopped on exposed mud. The old Spanish fort seawall, usually lapped by waves, now stood high and dry above a landscape that should have been underwater. Luis knew what this meant. Every fisherman knew. The old stories were explicit. When the earthquake makes the sea retreat, the sea is preparing to return. And when it returns, it comes as a wall. "We have to get to high ground," he shouted to Elena over the continuing roar. "Now. We have to go now." But the ground was still shaking too violently to walk. They could only watch in helpless horror as the Pacific Ocean gathered itself for revenge. In Valdivia, 15 kilometers inland and connected to the sea by the Valdivia River and its tributaries, no one yet understood what was coming from the ocean. They were still trapped in the immediate crisis of the earthquake itself. Only when the shaking finally began to diminish, after what felt like hours but had been approximately 3 minutes of peak intensity, could they begin to assess the devastation. The city was in ruins. In the fading light and the darkness of power failure, broken buildings lined every street. Fires had started in multiple locations where ruptured gas lines had ignited. The screams of trapped victims echoed from collapsed structures. The injured stumbled through rubble-strewn streets, bleeding, calling for help, searching for family members. The Calle River had breached its banks in several locations, flooding low-lying areas. Bridges had twisted and cracked, though most still stood in some form. Roberto Vivar's house on Isla Teja had partially collapsed. One wall had fallen outward, exposing the interior to the elements. But miraculously, the section where his family had sheltered held. He found Hildegard and the children alive, terrified, bruised and cut by flying debris, but alive. They clung to each other in the wreckage of their home, crying and praying, grateful beyond measure for their survival. Similar scenes played out across the region. Families reunited. Neighbors called to neighbors through the darkness. People began the instinctive work of helping the injured, of pulling survivors from rubble, of forming bucket brigades to fight the fires that threatened to spread through the broken city. They had survived the most powerful earthquake in recorded history. They allowed themselves to hope that the worst was over. They were wrong. The earthquake had been only the first act. The tsunami was gathering in the Pacific, waves as tall as buildings racing toward the coast at the speed of a jet aircraft. And in the mountains to the east, something else was awakening, something that would add a dimension of horror no one had anticipated. The evening of May 21, 1960, was far from over. Part 3. The Waves of Destruction. The massive displacement of the ocean floor had set in motion a chain of events that would affect the entire Pacific basin. When billions of tons of seafloor lurched upward by several meters along a 1,000-kilometer fault line, the water column above it had nowhere to go but up and outward. The initial wave formed not as a single crest, but as a complex series of undulations spreading across the ocean's surface at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour in the deep Pacific, as fast as a commercial jetliner. In the deep ocean, these waves were barely perceptible. A ship passing over them might notice nothing more than an unusual swell. But as they approached the Chilean coast, where the seafloor rose sharply from the abyssal plain to the continental shelf, the physics of water and motion became catastrophic. The waves slowed, compressed, and rose. What had been a gentle undulation in deep water became a wall of water 25 meters high in some locations, as tall as an 8-story building. The first wave struck the Chilean coast approximately 15 minutes after the earthquake's main shock ended. For Luis Enriquez and the residents of Corral, those 15 minutes were an eternity of desperate flight. As soon as the ground stopped shaking enough to permit movement, Luis and Elena had run from their house, joining hundreds of others scrambling up the steep hillside behind the town. Elena's legs burned with effort. Her lungs screamed for air. But Luis pulled her onward, upward, always upward. Behind them, they could hear the screams of those who were too injured to climb, too old to move quickly, or who simply didn't understand the danger in time. The harbor remained eerily empty, the exposed seabed gleaming wet in the fading twilight. Luis risked a glance back as they climbed and saw something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. On the horizon, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the ocean was rising. It wasn't a wave in the conventional sense, not a curling breaker like those that crashed on beaches. It was a surge, a lifting of the entire sea surface, advancing toward the land with the inexorable patience of a geological force. "Don't look back," he shouted to Elena. "Just climb." They were perhaps 30 meters above sea level when the tsunami hit Corral. The sound came first, a roar like continuous thunder mixed with the crash of shattering wood and the grinding of stone against stone. Then the water arrived, flooding into the emptied harbor and continuing inland without pause. It swept through the lower town in seconds, catching those who had remained at sea level. Fishing boats that had settled onto the harbor floor were picked up like toys and hurled inland. Buildings along the waterfront, some already damaged by the earthquake, were simply erased, their wooden walls exploding outward under the hydraulic pressure. Luis watched his boat, the Maria Elena named for his wife, lifted on the surge and smashed against the stone wall of the colonial fort. The vessel he had maintained meticulously for 20 years, the source of his livelihood and his pride, disintegrated in an instant. But he felt only gratitude. The boat was replaceable. His wife, gasping beside him on the hillside, was not. The water continued inland, following the topography, seeking the lowest ground. It surged up valleys and river courses, carrying with it a churning mass of debris, boats, cars, pieces of buildings, uprooted trees, and the bodies of those who had not reached high ground in time. In some places, the water traveled more than 3 kilometers inland before finally losing its energy and beginning to recede. But the first wave was not the end. It was barely the beginning. Tsunamis travel in wave trains, multiple surges separated by periods of retreat. Approximately 20 minutes after the first wave struck, the water that had flooded inland began to flow back toward the sea. This retreat was almost as destructive as the initial surge, dragging with it everything the first wave had loosened or damaged. Buildings that had survived the initial impact were undermined by the powerful backwash and collapsed into the receding water. Then the second wave arrived. In some locations, it was higher than the first. In Corral, survivors clinging to the hillside watched in horror as the ocean rose again, this time reaching even further inland. The Spanish fort, which had stood since 1645 and survived countless earthquakes and storms, suffered catastrophic damage as waves crashed against its seaward walls. The lighthouse that had guided ships into Corral's harbor for generations toppled into the churning water. In Valdivia, situated 15 kilometers inland along the winding Valdivia River, the initial impact was delayed but no less devastating. The city's residents, still reeling from the earthquake's destruction, were unprepared for what came next. The tsunami waves funneled up the river channel, amplified and accelerated by the narrowing waterway. The Vivar family, still sheltering in what remained of their house on Isla Teja, heard a new sound approximately 30 minutes after the main earthquake shock, a rushing, hissing roar approaching from the direction of the river. Roberto ran to what had been their front window, now just an empty frame, and saw the Calle River rising with impossible speed. The water, normally placid and slow-moving, had transformed into a violent torrent carrying a nightmare cargo of debris. "Get to the roof!" he screamed. "Climb! Climb now!" Hildegard grabbed their youngest child while Roberto hoisted the other two. They scrambled through the damaged house toward the attic access. Behind them, they could hear the water entering their home with a sound like an explosion. Roberto pushed his children through the attic opening, then hauled himself and Hildegard up just as the ground floor filled completely with churning water. From the attic, its roof partially collapsed but still providing some shelter, they watched the neighborhood transform into a violent river. Houses that had survived the earthquake were torn from their foundations and swept away. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and carried downstream like twigs. Cars tumbled through the water, their headlights occasionally flashing as electrical systems briefly activated before being extinguished forever. The screams were the worst part. Screams from people trapped in flooding houses, from people swept away by the current, from parents who had lost their grip on their children. Roberto covered his own children's ears, but he could not cover his own. He would hear those screams for the rest of his life. At the Valdivia hospital, Dr. Acuña and his staff faced an impossible situation. They had successfully evacuated most patients to the hospital grounds before the main earthquake shock ended. Now, with tsunami water surging through the city streets, that open ground had become a trap. The water rose rapidly around the huddled patients and staff, cold and contaminated with sewage, chemicals, and the detritus of the destroyed city. "The second floor!" someone shouted. "Back to the second floor!" It was a terrible choice. The building had been damaged by the earthquake and might collapse at any moment. But drowning was certain if they remained at ground level. Dr. Acuña helped carry patients back into the damaged structure, up the treacherous stairs, to the second floor that groaned ominously with each aftershock. They watched through cracked windows as the water continued to rise below them. 1 meter. 2 meters. In some low-lying areas of the city, the water reached depths of 4 meters. Nurse Maria Contreras moved among the patients, trying to provide comfort where medicine could not. An elderly man whose legs she had helped splint after the earthquake gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Are we going to die here?" he asked, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. Maria thought about lying, offering false reassurance. But something in his gaze demanded honesty. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But we're together. That counts for something." The water remained high for nearly an hour, its level rising and falling with the successive tsunami waves. Each retreat brought hope that the worst had passed. Each new surge crushed that hope. Survivors clung to rooftops, to trees, to anything that remained above the churning surface. Some lost their grip and vanished into the debris-choked water. Others held on through strength, or luck, or divine intervention. They would never be quite sure which. In the coastal town of Malin, 200 kilometers south of Valdivia, the tsunami arrived with even greater force. The town, built on low-lying ground at the mouth of the Malin River, had little protection from the ocean's fury. Waves estimated at 25 meters high, the height of an 8-story building, crashed over the town, obliterating nearly everything in their path. Of Malin's population of approximately 1,200 people, the wave killed an estimated 300 in minutes. Entire families disappeared, their homes and bodies swept out to sea, leaving no trace except the memories of those who had been elsewhere when the water came. The devastation extended far beyond Chile's immediate coastline. The tsunami waves radiated across the Pacific at jetliner speeds, carrying the earthquake's destructive energy to distant shores. 15 hours after the initial rupture, waves struck Hawaii, 10,000 kilometers away. In Hilo, on the Big Island, residents who had received tsunami warnings from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center faced a choice: evacuate to higher ground or stay and protect their property. Many chose to stay, underestimating the danger from a source so distant. The waves that hit Hilo that night reached heights of 10 meters in some locations. They swept through the waterfront district, demolishing buildings, tossing cars like toys, and killing 61 people. Among the dead was a group of spectators who had come down to the shore to watch the tsunami arrive, treating the deadly waves as a spectacle rather than a threat. They paid for that miscalculation with their lives. The waves continued westward. 22 hours after the Chilean earthquake, tsunami surges struck Japan, over 17,000 kilometers from the epicenter. Despite the enormous distance, the waves retained enough energy to be deadly. In the fishing village of Atsuchi, waves 5 meters high crashed over the seawalls, flooding homes and destroying boats. Across Japan, 142 people died and hundreds more were injured. Entire fishing fleets were destroyed, representing economic catastrophe for communities that depended on the sea. Even the Philippines, on the western edge of the Pacific, felt the earthquake's reach. Smaller but still significant tsunami waves struck the eastern coast, causing damage and some casualties. The 1960 Chilean earthquake and tsunami would ultimately be recorded as affecting virtually every coastline of the Pacific Ocean, a truly global disaster originating from a single violent rupture in the Earth's crust. Back in Chile, as the tsunami waves finally began to diminish in the early hours of May 22, the survivors emerged from their refuges to confront a transformed world. The cities and towns of southern Chile had been fundamentally altered. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. Landmarks that had defined communities for generations had vanished. The human cost was almost incomprehensible in its scale. Roberto Vivar and his family climbed down from their attic as dawn broke over East Lautaja. The water had receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and wreckage. Their house still stood, though it was a ruin. But they were alive. As Roberto surveyed the destruction, he saw neighbors emerging from other damaged buildings, stumbling through the debris, calling out names of missing family members. An old woman sat in the mud outside what had been her home, weeping silently. Two young boys picked their way carefully through the rubble, looking for their father. A dog barked frantically from the roof of a collapsed building, trapped but alive. These small human moments played out across the devastated region, grief and relief, loss and survival, intertwined in ways that defied simple categorization. At the hospital, Dr. Acuña counted his staff and patients as morning light filtered through the broken windows. Miraculously, they had lost no one to the tsunami, though several patients had died from injuries sustained in the earthquake itself. The doctor allowed himself a moment of exhausted gratitude before the next crisis demanded his attention. The hospital's medical supplies were damaged or destroyed. They had limited food and water. And the injured kept coming, people pulled from the wreckage, survivors of building collapses, victims of the tsunami's violence. In Corral, Luis and Elena Enriquez descended from the hillside with hundreds of other survivors to survey what remained of their town. The waterfront district was simply gone, not damaged, but erased, as if it had never existed. The old colonial buildings, the fish markets, the small shops and cafes that had given Corral its character, all had been swept into the Pacific. Bodies lay among the debris, some recognizable, others not. The survivors moved among them quietly, identifying friends and neighbors, saying prayers, beginning the grim work of recovery. But even as the coastal communities began to comprehend the scale of the tsunami's destruction, another catastrophe was developing inland. In the Andes Mountains east of Valdivia, the massive earthquake had triggered something that would add a new dimension of horror to an already unimaginable disaster. The earthquake had destabilized mountains, fractured glaciers, and set in motion events that would soon unleash millions of cubic meters of rock, ice, and water onto the valleys below. The earthquake and tsunami had been natural disasters of extraordinary magnitude. What came next would prove that nature's capacity for destruction was not yet exhausted. The mountains were preparing to collapse. Sebastián Ramírez, a farmer who had survived the earthquake by sheltering in his barn, stood in his yard and watched the landslide approach. For a moment, he was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The scale was too vast to process. His mind kept insisting it wasn't real, that mountains didn't simply slide into valleys, that this must be some trick of the light, or his earthquake shock senses playing tricks. Then his survival instinct overcame his paralysis. "Run!" he screamed to his wife and children. "To the hill! Run now!" They fled across their fields, abandoning everything, livestock, possessions, their home itself, in a desperate sprint toward higher ground. Behind them, the landslide reached the valley floor with the force of a bomb. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years were snapped like matchsticks. Houses were pulverized into splinters. The Ramirez farmhouse, where Sebastián had been born and where his father and grandfather had been born before him, disappeared under thousands of tons of rock and debris in less than a second. But the landslide's destruction was only beginning. The massive debris flow crashed into the Rinanahi River, which drained Lake Rinanahew to the east. The impact created a natural dam of rock and earth that completely blocked the river's flow. Within minutes, the water that had been flowing west toward Valdivia began to back up behind the debris dam, trapped and rising. Lake Rinanahew, already swollen with water from the earthquake-triggered waves that had sloshed across its surface, now began to expand dramatically as the blocked river water accumulated with nowhere to go. The lake level rose 1 meter, then 2, then 5. Forests along the shoreline flooded. The small settlements that dotted the lake's edge were inundated, their residents fleeing to higher ground as the water crept inexorably upward. The Ramirez family, watching from their hilltop refuge, saw their entire valley transform into an expanding lake. The debris dam held a massive wall of rubble that had replaced the river with a growing reservoir. Sebastian understood the implications immediately. If that dam ever failed, if the accumulated water pressure became too great, or if another earthquake shock destabilized the debris, the resulting flood would be catastrophic. Millions of cubic meters of water would rush down the valley toward Valdivia, sweeping away everything in its path. "We can't stay here," he told his wife, Rosa. "We have to warn the people downstream. They have to evacuate." But how could they warn anyone? The roads were destroyed. The telephone lines, those that had existed in this remote region, were down. The earthquake had severed all normal communication. Sebastian made a decision. He would walk. However far it took, however long, he would reach Valdivia and warn them about the lake growing in the mountains. He left at dawn on May 22nd, after a sleepless night spent watching the lake rise by moonlight. The journey that would normally take a few hours by car took him 3 days on foot, navigating destroyed roads, collapsed bridges, and landslide debris. He ate what he could forage, drank from streams, and kept moving. Behind him, Lake Rinanahew continued to swell. While Sebastian walked, other mountains were failing. The earthquake had weakened slopes throughout the Andes, and aftershocks, some quite powerful, continued to shake the region. Each new tremor brought new landslides. On May 22nd, a massive slope failure on Chashuenco volcano sent millions of cubic meters of volcanic rock cascading down the mountain's eastern flank. The landslide dammed another river, creating another expanding lake. These secondary disasters received little attention in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami. The coastal cities were focused on the overwhelming crisis of collapsed buildings, fires, thousands of injured, and uncounted dead. The government in Santiago, over 800 kilometers to the north, was struggling to comprehend the scope of the catastrophe and organize a response. The rural communities in the Andes, isolated by destroyed infrastructure, suffered their catastrophes largely alone. In the mountain village of Nelchum, population roughly 500, the earthquake had caused extensive damage, but relatively few casualties. The wooden buildings had flexed and survived, though many were damaged. Then, on May 23rd, a landslide triggered by an aftershock destroyed the village's connection to the outside world. The single road that linked Nelchum to the regional network was buried under meters of rock and debris. The village was cut off completely, with no way to call for help or report casualties and no way for aid to reach them. The villagers, led by their mayor, Hector Silva, organized themselves with the resourcefulness born of isolation. They treated their injured with whatever medical supplies they had. They rationed food and water. They cleared spaces for the homeless to shelter. And they waited, knowing that eventually, days, weeks, however long it took, help would arrive. They had survived the earthquake and the landslides. They would survive the waiting. But the most catastrophic of the landslides was still to come. On May 24th, 3 days after the main earthquake, the slopes of Cordon Col, already fractured and unstable from the sustained shaking, finally collapsed in spectacular fashion. A massive section of the mountain, including significant portions of its glaciers, detached and fell into the valley of the Hilo River. The volume of material involved was staggering. Geologists would later estimate approximately 60 million cubic meters of rock, ice, and debris. The landslide traveled at tremendous speed, accelerated by the steep slope and lubricated by melting glacial ice. It reached velocities exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, a moving mountain that obliterated everything in its path. When it reached the Hilo River, the impact created a debris dam over 70 meters high, as tall as a 20-story building. The river, completely blocked, began to form another lake behind the massive barrier. But this lake was different from Lake Rinanahi. The Hilo Valley was steeper, narrower, and the debris dam, while enormous, was composed of loosely consolidated material that might not hold for long. Water began accumulating immediately. Within hours, a lake that hadn't existed before noon on May 24th was kilometers long and still growing. The forests drowned. Wildlife fled to higher ground. And downstream, in the valleys that would be in the path if the dam failed, people who had survived the earthquake and tsunami now faced a new threat they didn't even know existed. The Chilean government, still struggling to organize relief efforts for the coastal cities, was barely aware of the mountain disasters. Communication with the remote Andean regions was virtually non-existent. The few reports that filtered through spoke of landslides and blocked roads, but the full scope of the situation remained unclear. Officials in Santiago debated the allocation of limited resources. Should they focus on the cities where thousands were confirmed dead and injured, or divert resources to investigate vague reports from the mountains? The decision was made, perhaps inevitably, to prioritize the cities. The coastal disasters were visible, quantifiable, and possible to ignore. The mountain catastrophes were distant, poorly understood, and seemed less immediately threatening. It was a reasonable decision based on available information. It was also a mistake that would have deadly consequences. On May 26, 5 days after the main earthquake, Sebastián Ramírez finally reached the outskirts of Valdivia. The city he found was almost unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods were rubble. The streets were clogged with debris and patrolled by soldiers enforcing martial law. Fires still burned in several districts despite days of firefighting efforts. The dead lay in rows in the city plaza, awaiting identification and burial. Sebastián, exhausted and filthy from his 5-day journey, tried to report to authorities about the lake growing behind the Traucan landslide dam. He was directed from one official to another, each overwhelmed with immediate crises and unable to focus on a distant, abstract threat. Finally, a young army lieutenant listened to his story and promised to pass the information up the chain of command. "You should evacuate the valley," Sebastián insisted, gripping the lieutenant's arm with the fervor of desperation. "If that dam breaks, the water will destroy everything downstream. Thousands of people could die." The lieutenant nodded wearily. "I'll report it, senor. I promise. But you can see the situation here. We're doing what we can." Sebastián wanted to argue, to make them understand the urgency, but he could see the truth in the lieutenant's exhausted eyes. Valdivia was already devastated. The authorities were barely keeping ahead of the crises they could see. An invisible lake in the mountains, threatening an invisible future disaster, would have to wait. In the mountains, the lakes continued to rise. Lake Rinanahu was now over 20 meters above its original level, a massive reservoir of water held back by nothing more than a pile of earthquake debris. The new lake behind the Cordon Call landslide was expanding even faster, fed by melting glacial ice and spring runoff from the high peaks. The debris dams were being tested by immense and growing hydraulic pressure. The people living in the shadow of these dams had no idea of the danger accumulating above them. They were focused on rebuilding from the earthquake, on clearing rubble, on mourning their dead and treating their injured. They didn't know that in the mountains to the east, millions of cubic meters of water were building behind barriers that might fail at any moment. The Andes, shaken to their foundations by the most powerful earthquake in recorded history, were preparing one final act of destruction. And when it came, it would demonstrate that even after a magnitude 9.5 earthquake and a Pacific-wide tsunami, nature's capacity for catastrophe was not yet exhausted. The survivors of May 21st had endured the earth breaking beneath them and the ocean rising to consume their cities. Soon, they would face the mountains falling and the waters descending. The disaster that had already claimed thousands of lives was far from over. Part 5: The Aftermath and the Reckoning. The dam failures began in June, 3 weeks after the earthquake, just as the survivors of the coastal cities were beginning to believe the worst had passed. On June 6, following several days of heavy rain that added to the already critical water levels behind the Traucan landslide dam, the debris barrier began to show signs of failure. Water started seeping through the loosely consolidated rock and earth, carving small channels that quickly widened into torrents. The dam, which had held back Lake Rinanahu for 16 days, was disintegrating. Rosa Ramirez, still sheltering with her children on the hillside above their flooded valley, was among the first to witness the catastrophe. She saw the water level of the artificial lake begin to drop, not gradually, but with alarming speed. Then she heard it, a roar like the end of the world as the debris dam gave way completely and millions of cubic meters of water burst through the breach. The flood wave that rushed down the Rinanahu Valley was over 10 meters high in places, a churning mass of water carrying with it the debris of the dam itself, boulders, trees, pieces of buildings swept up from the flooded valley floor. It traveled at approximately 30 kilometers per hour, fast enough that anyone caught in its path had virtually no chance of escape. The small town of Los Lagos, situated downstream from the failed dam, received only minutes of warning. A farmer on the town's outskirts saw the water coming and ran through the streets screaming for people to flee to higher ground. Most residents, conditioned by 3 weeks of disaster, didn't hesitate. They ran. They climbed. They abandoned everything and scrambled toward the hills. But some didn't make it. The elderly, the injured from the earthquake, small children who couldn't run fast enough, the flood caught them as it swept through Los Lagos. Buildings that had survived the earthquake were demolished by the hydraulic force. The town's small hospital, where Dr. Carmen Figueroa had been treating earthquake victims for 3 weeks, was struck by the flood wave while still occupied. Dr. Figueroa and 2 nurses managed to evacuate most patients to the 2nd floor before the water hit, but 3 patients on the ground floor, too injured to move, drowned in their beds. The flood continued westward, following the valley toward Valdivia. As it traveled, it gradually spread out and lost some of its initial devastating height, but it remained a powerful and destructive force. Towns and farms in its path suffered catastrophic damage. Bridges that had survived the earthquake were torn from their foundations. Roads were buried under meters of mud and debris. The death toll climbed with each kilometer the flood traveled. In Valdivia, the warning finally reached authorities with enough time to evacuate the low-lying areas. Soldiers and police moved through the neighborhoods along the river, ordering residents to higher ground immediately. Many protested. They had just begun rebuilding, just started to reclaim some semblance of normal life after the earthquake and tsunami. Now they were being forced to abandon their homes again? "This is not a request," a sergeant shouted at a group of residents who were arguing. "The flood is coming. If you stay, you will die. Move now!" The flood wave reached Valdivia on the evening of June 6. It had diminished considerably from its initial height, but was still a powerful surge that overwhelmed the river's banks and flooded neighborhoods that had been above the tsunamis reached 3 weeks earlier. The water rose 3 meters in some areas, inundating hundreds of homes and businesses. The evacuation had saved lives. Casualties in Valdivia were minimal, but the psychological impact was devastating. The survivors of the earthquake and tsunami, who had been working desperately to rebuild, now watched as their efforts were literally washed away. Roberto Vivar stood on a hill overlooking Isla Teja and watched the flood surge through the neighborhood where his damaged house still stood. He had his family with him, Hildegard and the children, safe on high ground. But watching the water rise again, seeing the neighborhood flood for the second time in 3 weeks, something broke inside him. He sat down on the wet grass and wept, great racking sobs that shook his whole body. Hildegard sat beside him and held him, unable to offer words that would mean anything, simply present in his grief. The Traucan Dam failure was not the last. On June 11th, the Cordon-Call landslide dam, which had created the rapidly expanding lake in the Hilo Valley, catastrophically failed. The resulting flood was even more powerful than the Renato disaster, sending a wall of water over 15 meters high down the valley. The remote communities in the Hilo region had even less warning than those downstream from Traucan. Entire settlements were erased. Families were swept away with no chance to flee. The exact death toll would never be known with certainty. Many of the victims were from isolated farms and small villages whose populations had never been precisely counted. Bodies were found kilometers downstream, buried in mud, caught in debris. Others were never found at all, their final resting places unmarked and unknown. Over the following weeks, additional dams failed in the Andes. Not all the failures were as catastrophic as Traucan or Cordon-Call. Some dams held long enough for the water levels to gradually decrease through seepage, while others failed in areas where the downstream valleys were unpopulated. But each failure added to the death toll. Each flood brought new destruction to a region already devastated beyond comprehension. The final accounting of the disaster would take months, even years. The Chilean government's official death toll from the earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent floods would eventually be recorded as approximately 1,655 people, though many historians believe the actual number was significantly higher. Thousands more were injured, some catastrophically. An estimated 2 million people, roughly 1/6 of Chile's entire population, were affected by the disaster in some way. The economic damage was staggering. Entire cities had been destroyed. The port city of Puerto Saavedra was so thoroughly demolished by the tsunami that authorities decided to abandon the site entirely, and rebuild the city on higher ground. In Valdivia, an estimated 40% of the buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The cost of reconstruction would exceed $550 million in 1960 dollars, equivalent to over $5 billion today, an enormous sum for a developing nation. But the disaster also catalyzed changes that would reverberate far beyond Chile's borders. The 1960 earthquake demonstrated that seismic events could trigger tsunamis capable of crossing entire ocean basins with deadly effect. The deaths in Hawaii and Japan from a Chilean earthquake shocked the international scientific community into action. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, which had been established after a devastating 1946 tsunami, was expanded and improved. New seismological stations were built around the Pacific Rim. Communication networks were established to ensure that tsunami warnings could reach vulnerable populations within minutes rather than hours. The earthquake also revolutionized the science of seismology. Before 1960, scientists had theoretical models suggesting that earthquakes could reach magnitude 9 or higher, but they had never observed one. The Valdivia earthquake provided unprecedented data about how the Earth's crust behaves under extreme stress. Seismologists studied the recorded seismic waves, mapped the fault rupture, measured the uplift and subsidence of the land, and used this information to develop better understanding of plate tectonics and earthquake mechanics. Dr. Renato Acuña, who had somehow kept Valdivia Hospital functioning through the earthquake, tsunami, and floods, would spend the rest of his career advocating for better building codes and disaster preparedness. He had seen firsthand how structural failures killed people who might otherwise have survived. He became a fierce proponent of earthquake-resistant construction techniques and emergency response planning. When he died in 1989, his obituary noted that the hospital policies and building standards he had championed had undoubtedly saved lives in subsequent Chilean earthquakes. For the individual survivors, the path forward was complex and deeply personal. Sebastián Ramírez, the farmer who had walked for days to warn Valdivia about the growing lake, never returned to his valley. The land where his family had farmed for 3 generations remained flooded for years, transformed into a permanent lake that locals began calling Lago Rainihu. The government eventually stabilized what remained of the debris dam and accepted the new lake as a permanent feature of the landscape. Sebastián took his family north to Santiago, where he found work in construction. He never quite adapted to city life, his mind always returning to the mountains he had lost. Luis and Elena Enriquez rebuilt their lives in Corral, though the town they reconstructed bore little resemblance to the one that had been swept away. The old colonial architecture was largely gone, replaced by modern concrete structures designed to withstand both earthquakes and tsunamis. Luis bought a new boat with disaster relief funds and returned to fishing, but he never forgot the sight of the Maria Elena being destroyed. He named his new vessel Esperanza, Hope, and painted his wife's name on the stern in letters large enough to be seen from shore. The Vivar family stayed in Valdivia, living first in a relief tent city, then in temporary housing, and finally in a small concrete house built as part of the reconstruction effort. Roberto found work at a rebuilt sawmill, though the new facility bore no resemblance to the one where he had worked before. Hildegard took a job at a relief center, distributing food and supplies to families still displaced by the disaster. Their children grew up with fragmented memories of the earthquake, sensory impressions of shaking and screaming and fear that they couldn't quite organize into coherent narratives. Carmen, their eldest daughter, who had been 12 when the earthquake struck, would later become a civil engineer specializing in seismic design. She told interviewers that her career choice was directly influenced by living through the 1960 disaster. "I wanted to build things that wouldn't fall down when the earth shook," she explained. "I wanted to create safety in a world that had shown me how suddenly everything could be destroyed." The communities of southern Chile rebuilt slowly, adapting to a transformed landscape. The earthquake had permanently altered the region's geography. Some areas had subsided by over 2 meters, while others had been uplifted by similar amounts. Coastlines had changed shape. Rivers flowed along new courses. The artificial lakes created by landslide dams became permanent features, eventually stocked with fish and incorporated into the local economy and ecology. In the mountains, forests slowly reclaimed the landslide scars. The debris that had dammed rivers became colonized by vegetation, transformed from raw wound to part of the living landscape. Nature, which had been so catastrophically violent in May 1960, resumed its patient work of growth and recovery. The survivors carried their trauma in different ways. Some spoke about it constantly, needing to repeat their stories as a form of processing. Others fell silent, unable or unwilling to articulate what they had experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet widely recognized or treated in 1960, and many survivors suffered symptoms for years without understanding what was wrong or how to seek help. Nightmares were common. Panic attacks triggered by minor tremors or unusual sounds. A hypervigilance about escape routes and safe spaces that never entirely faded. But alongside the trauma was resilience. Communities that had been devastated came together with remarkable solidarity. Neighbors helped neighbors rebuild. Families took in those who had lost everything. The sense of shared suffering created bonds that transcended class and social divisions. In the aftermath of catastrophe, people discovered reserves of strength and compassion they hadn't known they possessed. On May 21, 1970, 10 years after the earthquake, Chile held its first National Day of Remembrance for the disaster. Survivors gathered in plazas and cemeteries across southern Chile to honor those who had died and to mark how far they had come in the decades since the earth broke. In Valdivia, thousands assembled in the rebuilt Plaza de la República, where a monument had been erected listing the names of the confirmed dead. Roberto Vivar attended with his family. They stood before the monument reading the names, so many names, including some of people they had known, people from their neighborhood who hadn't made it to safety when the tsunami came. Roberto placed a hand on the cold stone and whispered a prayer, not just for the dead but for the living, for all of them who carried the weight of survival. The ceremony included speeches by government officials and clergy, but the moment that resonated most deeply was when an elderly woman, a survivor from Corral, was invited to speak. She walked slowly to the microphone, her hands shaking slightly, and looked out at the assembled crowd. "We are still here," she said simply, her voice barely audible at first, then growing stronger. The earth shook. The ocean rose. The mountains fell. But we are still here. We remember those who are gone. We honor them by living, by rebuilding, by refusing to let that day be the end of our story. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then someone began to applaud. The applause spread, growing into a sustained ovation that lasted several minutes. People were crying, not just with grief, but with pride, with defiant joy at having endured, having survived, having rebuilt their lives from rubble and ash. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake remained, more than 60 years later, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded by instruments. It stood as a marker of what nature was capable of at its most violent. But it also stood as testament to human resilience, to the capacity of communities to endure unimaginable catastrophe and emerge, if not unscathed, then at least unbowed. In the decades following the disaster, Chile became a world leader in earthquake preparedness and seismic engineering. The lessons learned in 1960 about building codes, tsunami warning systems, emergency response coordination were applied not just in Chile but around the world. When a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck Chile in 2010, the death toll was dramatically lower than it might have been, largely because of the knowledge gained from the 1960 disaster. The survivors, those who lived long enough to see these developments, took some comfort in knowing that their suffering had contributed to knowledge that protected others. The disaster that had taken so much from them had at least given something to the world, a better understanding of how to survive when the earth betrays the trust we place in its solidity. On quiet days in southern Chile, when the sky is clear and the Pacific lies calm beyond the coastal hills, it is possible to almost forget that this peaceful landscape was once the epicenter of the most powerful geological event in human history. The cities have been rebuilt. The forests have regrown. The lakes created by landslides have become part of the natural beauty of the region. But the survivors never forget. They feel it in their bones when minor tremors shake the region, which they still do regularly. They see it in the tsunami evacuation route signs that mark the streets of every coastal town. They remember it each May 21st, when the whole country pauses to honor those who were lost and those who endured. The earth broke on May 21st, 1960. But the people did not break. They bent, they grieved, they suffered beyond what should be endurable. And then, slowly, painfully, courageously, they rebuilt. That rebuilding, that refusal to surrender to catastrophe, is perhaps the most important part of the story. The earthquake demonstrated the awesome power of geological forces beyond human control. The recovery demonstrated something equally powerful, the human capacity to face the unthinkable, to mourn the irreplaceable, and to continue nevertheless. This is the legacy of the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, not just destruction, but survival. Not just loss, but resilience. Not just the breaking of the earth, but the endurance of the human spirit in the face of forces that dwarf our individual existence. The ground beneath our feet may prove unreliable, the ocean may rise against us, the mountains may fall. But we remain. We rebuild. We remember. And we continue.